We are committed to creating a safe and supportive space for our guests and listeners, and to provide information and tools that will help our listeners understand, manage, and overcome trauma. We understand that the healing journey can bring up challenging emotions. Therefore, we want to warn our audience that certain episodes may contain discussions or stories that could be triggering for some individuals. The content of the podcast is for educational and informative purposes only, and we encourage you to practice self-care and discretion while listening, and to reach out to a trusted support system or professional if you feel overwhelmed and need help on your healing journey. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Healing and Growing Hand in Hand podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Tickle, and today we have a guest. Her name is Dr. Mary Catherine McDonald, and she's going to go by MC. I'm going to call her MC today. She is a PhD trauma researcher. She is a certified life coach, and then she's also the author of Unbroken: The Trauma Response is Never Wrong. This is so timely. And so what I found you on TikTok. But I was mentioning that I read an article that you wrote that I really want to talk about today, which is really great. It's in Psychology Today, and it's called Rethinking Trauma, Understanding Intrusion Symptoms. And I love one of your quotes, which is, the trauma response is a strength response, not a sign of weakness or disorder, which is so encouraging. So MC, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. You covered it. I'm a PhD trauma researcher, and I work in an interdisciplinary fashion. So I bring in psychology together with neuroscience and philosophy to look critically at the field of psychology and mental health in general.
Right.
And the space that I've done the most of my research is trauma. And so I have a number of articles, and I wrote a book called Unbroken, which is very much in line with the article that you read on Psychology Today. Mm-hmm. And the main sort of the crux of my message is that I think if we can revise our understanding societally of trauma as a strength response, then we can peel away the shame that gets in the way of healing.
Yes. There is so much shame. Yeah. And it's interesting because I mentioned this on some of my past podcasts that a few months ago I got triggered. Oh, yeah. And, it was the first time that I became completely aware of the beginning of the trauma when it first hit the intrusion part, which I want you to explain more, which is really interesting. All the way to the end when I realized that I was being triggered, and I automatically wanted to do a self-sabotaging thing to myself, but instead had enough awareness to say, I'm going to do something different. And that's pretty much what you kind of describe in the article. So tell us about the intrusion symptoms.
Yes. So let's define trauma, and then we can get to intrusion, and then we can unpack how that works. So yes, because I think what I found when I first started researching trauma was that there's still a lot of debate about which kinds of events count as traumatic events and how do we define trauma. And so I like to start and make sure we're all on the same page. Yes. The definition that I use is, it's almost like a formula. You have the potential for a chronic trauma if you have an event that produced unbearable emotions that lacked a relational home. So a lot of the times we have unbearable emotions, but we have a good support system and network to be able to process these things and put them away. When we don't, what is traumatic in the moment becomes lastingly so.
Yes.
And the central symptom, even though I guess the central umbrella of symptoms when you have chronic trauma is intrusion. And so this can come up in many different ways, but essentially because of the way that the traumatic memory gets filed away, it kind of in a problematic way for your brain, which I can explain in a second, your brain tries to give you opportunities over and over again to reorganize the memory file. And these come up in our day-to-day lives as intrusive thoughts. They can come up as nightmares. They can come out in repetitive behavior that we're not really conscious that we're repeating. So we'll sometimes repeat an entire dynamic from one relationship to another to kind of give ourselves the chance to, do differently, as you said a minute ago. And then the other thing is when things come up that trigger us. So essentially when something comes up in your periphery in some way, you experience some little fragment that is reminiscent of this disorganized memory file. And your brain recognizes that as danger and threat, and it sets off a set of stress responses. So to unpack the stress responses really quickly, this is the heart of the trauma response. We come to this earth as biological beings that have hardwired a set of emergency mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And these emergency mechanisms are the trauma response. They're designed to try to keep us alive in moments of incredible overwhelm and danger. Mm. And so this is typically, we talk about fight, flight, and freeze.
Right.
And these are the responses that kick in. They're there for a reason. They're adaptive. This is the part where you talked about how like it's a strength response.
Yes.
We have these defenses so that when something is sufficiently overwhelming, we can sort of separate from the situation and keep ourselves alive. And so the trauma response at its root is a strength response, not a sign of weakness or disorder. The place where that gets really confusing is in the experience that you just talked about. When you get triggered, you're like, okay, crap, like I'm feeling terrible. I'm having this really outsized emotional response to a situation that's not actually dangerous, and I can't seem to control it. So what do I do? And that gives us an idea of what typically needs to happen in trauma healing, which is that this memory needs to be integrated in such a way that you can be aware of it, as you said, and get enough distance from the response to be like, hold on, I'm having an overwhelming response. Here's why. Now here, I'm going to do something different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Cause that, and it was interesting because I was triggered when I was initially triggered. I was triggered in a place that wasn't safe, where I couldn't say what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then a couple hours later, I was with my husband, and he definitely is one of my safe spaces for sure. He has seen, all sides of me. And I remember sitting in the car, and he allowed me to just say the crazy stuff that was in my head. Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm listening to this as it's coming out, and it's just it was crazy. And I just finally looked at him. I said, clearly I am being triggered. I am clearly being triggered because what is going on in my head and what's coming out of my mouth, there's no logical sense to it. Mm-hmm. And then to kind of top it off, like I said, my automatic response was to do something that would be self-sabotaging to me. Mm-hmm. And I recognized that. And I recognized how, I'll just say it for myself, but wacky I was thinking, because it really was. And I just looked at him and I said, I am clearly being triggered. We're not going to go do that crazy thing that I told you we're going to do. We're going to go do the smart thing. And so it was, for me, it was really helpful that my husband allowed me to just say it. Mm-hmm. And it was ugly and it made no sense. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, I felt so much better. But in the place where I wasn't safe, that was a little struggle to try to kind of manage that when I was in a place where I couldn't release that tension or whatever it is.
And actually what you're describing is actually like, it's almost a micro experience of a trauma. That's exactly what happens in the initial traumatic event, is that you can't process and file away what's happening in the way that you do with all the rest of your things. So if I'm like living my day-to-day life, I go to the grocery store, something funny happens. At the end of that experience, I get a very neatly organized file folder that I can pull out, refer to in language, and put away.
Right.
Fear brain doesn't have access to that file because it's so organized.
Right.
But when you have something that's incredibly overwhelming, your brain and body adapt really miraculously, again, to help you survive in that moment. But one of the things that gets shut down is that filing mechanism. And so you get a fragmented memory that can only be read by the fear part of your brain. Mm-hmm. So when you get triggered by something in your experience, in the moment, in the present moment, you are reliving the traumatic event.
Yes.
And so our behavior stops making sense to us. And this can feel really out of control because it's essentially the fear part of the brain, the amygdala and the limbic system, that are making decisions based on what they perceive to be mortal danger. And your rational brain is shut out of the conversation.
Totally.
And so there's something like neurobiologically, real that's happening there that we need to understand, because there's no need to be ashamed of that.
Right. And it was interesting because I know exactly what the trigger was. I know exactly what the memory was that it took me back to. Mm. And it absolutely felt like when I was a little girl and that situation happened. Mm. And that's exactly the way I felt at that moment. Mm. And it collided with common sense.
Yeah.
It totally collided.
Yeah.
But again, when it first hit me, I was in a place where I couldn't open up and just say what I wanted to say. Mm-hmm. And it took me a little bit to kind of really push it aside and just go have a good time. And, I was with family. But it was still with me because as soon as my husband and I were alone, boom, it was right back there. And I needed it. I didn't realize it at the time. It looked back now and I see I needed to say it.
Yeah.
Because it is so true. I know when I worked with a lot of women healing from childhood abuse, that so many times when you say this stuff out loud, it loses its power, it loses its strength, and it loses its grip on you. And all of a sudden you're able to go, wait a minute, that makes no sense.
Right. And
it catches you.
And the neurobiology correlate to that is that when you're saying the thing out loud, you're manually putting your prefrontal cortex, which is like the rational mind, back
there you
into
go.
the conversation. So that's not just like people have said that forever, name it to tame it, but the neurobiology actually supports that. When you name something, you're bringing in the part of your brain that just got shut down. So it's almost like you're re-regulating the blood flow and electrical activity in your brain, which will make you feel calm.
That makes sense.
Super cool, right?
Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool. And, and I found too, and I've heard this before, and I actually used it in this situation where you get triggered and there's a space between trigger and response.
Yeah.
But you have to catch that. And that's where self-awareness comes in. So you have to recognize, oh, okay, crazy stuff going on in my head. I'm clearly being triggered.
Yeah.
Take a breath, take a minute.
Yeah.
And and if you are in a safe place, if you can say this stuff, like I said, my husband is just a safe place. He lets me say stuff, anything, and he doesn't judge me or criticize me. And it really worked. That really worked. That pause, the deep breath,
the
talking it out, and then immediately switching gears.
Yep. And I want to normalize for folks who are listening that often, especially in regards to a trauma trigger, there doesn't feel like there's ever going to be any space between the stimulus and the response, because there's a lot of work that has to get done to even connect the dots and recognize that this stimulus is causing this response. A lot of the time we don't even realize that. We just are often running off to the races, feeling panicked or yelling or behaving or, fighting, flighting, or freezing. And so with work, that space can be created, and it doesn't take much for the whole experience to change. Because as you experienced, even being able to just step away for like a millisecond and recognize like, oh, my brain is going down a path it doesn't usually go down. What's going on here? Like, this doesn't feel like me. This behavior that I'm about to do maybe feels a little bit outsized for the situation. Hold on. Like that's all it takes. And then the whole of your life can look different.
Yeah. And I lived so much of my life until about probably 7 or 8 years ago, where I was in survival mode. It was fight or flight. And so I recognize when I look back on it that I'm sure my anxiety was always right here, right? Because I was in a fight and flight.
Yep.
And then something would happen. I would get triggered and it would just be so over the top.
Yep.
It was, and you just completely feel out of control, completely, you feel hopeless. It's a really kind of scary place to be.
Yep.
And I lived so many of my years like that, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And so having that awareness, and I mean, I think everybody can get triggered, right? You don't have to have abuse or childhood trauma per se. You can get triggered, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, our brains are consolidating and creating memory files for every single event that we experience in our lives. And any event that doesn't get filed away in an organized way that fits in with all the rest of the files can be something that provokes a trigger. Because what happens is, if you imagine like the little guys in the file room, they are trying to make sure that all the files are organized, and they have one in their queue that doesn't make sense.
Doesn't fit anywhere.
Exactly. So anytime they see a remnant of that, they throw that to the front of your mind as an opportunity for you to reorganize it. But that could be anything. There are so many misconceptions about the way that we talk about triggers currently. It's amazing that more people are talking about them, and we're normalizing that they exist and that they're real, but it's also really important that we talk about them correctly.
Yes.
And one of the things I think that's incorrect is that this idea that like, if you don't have PTSD, then you can't be triggered. If you don't have a capital T trauma, that you can't be triggered. But in reality, the neurobiology shows us that anytime you have a disorganized file, that is going to provoke a trigger of some amount.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So it could be, I
it could be literally like anything. It could be that like, if you felt in a relationship that never rose to the level of abuse, but you felt trapped in that relationship. And let's say your partner uses a particular phrase when you're having conflict, and then 20 years down the road, you're having a conversation with your boss, they use that same phrase, and all of a sudden you're feeling a level of trapped that doesn't fit with the situation.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you have PTSD and you had it the whole time. Doesn't mean that relationship was abusive, right? It just means that you felt trapped in that moment that didn't get processed, filed away, and integrated. And so it comes up again.
Right. I actually have one. This sounds kind of weird, but it makes sense. I don't like going in garages when cars are being worked on.
Oh, interesting.
And I mean, I have to work on that. Like when I take my car in and stuff, like I don't want to be in that garage, especially if a car started for some, that I don't quite understand. But my brother used to work on his car in the garage, and he would get mad because something would happen and tools would go flying.
Yep.
I walked out more than once and almost got hit by a tool. And so, that's a trigger for me. And it doesn't always hit me every time I go. It just under certain situations, like if there's loud noises, that's what kind of gets me. But it's interesting. And I'll have to work on that one.
That's actually such a good example though, because it's such a beautiful, you can see. So the reason that these, mechanisms exist, these emergency mechanisms exist, is to keep us alive.
Right.
And I can say that, but that doesn't necessarily like speak to anybody. But with an example like that, it's really alive, because what happened is in that moment when your brother was doing that and you had that experience, probably more than once, your brain codes garage and car mechanic as danger.
Yep.
Because it's trying to catalog which things in the world are safe, which things are neutral, and which things are dangerous. And it coded that as dangerous.
Right.
So then you come into this situation with, you're getting your car worked on, you have to go in and like talk to the guy and whatever. And you're feeling that panic again because your brain is trying to remind you, hey, this thing might be dangerous. I want to make sure you're paying attention.
Yeah.
So it's such a beautiful, and even the way that you talked about it a minute ago, you were like, I have to work on this, which suggests like there's maybe some shame there, but
that's true. Yeah, there is.
Right.
Because it seems silly. I go into a garage and I'm triggered, it seems silly. Right.
But your brain it thinks it's in danger. Just because the rational part of your mind knows that it isn't, doesn't matter. And like, if we imagine the fear part of your brain as like a little kid, like maybe a 6-year-old, like if the 6-year-old was afraid to go into a garage, we wouldn't turn around and say, what the hell's wrong with you? Or maybe we would in an abusive situation. What the hell's wrong with you? We would say, oh my gosh, you're scared. What's going on? What are you scared of? Oh, okay. I understand why that might seem dangerous, but it isn't. Let me tell you why. And then we would kind of guide that child into the experience again. But we don't do that with ourselves. We shame ourselves and we say, I'm broken. What the hell's wrong with me? And
it just seems so silly and ridiculous. But it makes sense. It makes sense. So I know there's a lot of talk about the subconscious, and that we hold a lot of we don't have control over our subconscious, right? And a lot of stuff is stored there. And that's where it comes from, right? Is it the triggers or the memories come from our subconscious. Is that correct?
It depends on what theory you're prescribing to. And because there's a lot about the mind that we don't really know fully.
Yeah. True.
But so from like a Jungian perspective, yes, there is a subconscious that is always impacting your behavior in ways that you are not aware of. Okay. And part of what it is to be human is to figure out what your behavior is telling you about what's underneath there, to kind of bring some of that into the light. Also, from a neurobiological perspective, you can look at it from like an energy store perspective. So if you have this incredibly sophisticated, huge filing room in the back of your brain, and you have limited energy stores in your brain, you're not always in the back room there doing filing. So there's stuff that's there. It's in the files, it's filed away in the file cabinets, but it's not like front of mind, because if it was all front of mind, that wouldn't make any sense.
No.
And so you can call those sort of like unrecalled memories that aren't really available in this moment until you start like digging them out as kind of unconscious in a different way from a neurobiological perspective. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Cause I've heard that, there's a lot of talk about that. And so, and I know we're learning so much. I mean, we've learned so much, and just the fact that learning that the trauma got stored in my body, actually physically got stored in my body. And that what's empowering with that though, is I can help bring it out. I can, I don't have to just live with this.
Right.
And so I could be wrong, but do you believe that it's true that you don't necessarily heal from trauma or from triggers, but that you just learn how to manage them?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that depends on like what those words mean to people, you know,
True.
Sometimes people say things like, I will know that I'm healed when I stop having any emotion about this experience. And that's not really realistic, because your brain remembers emotions. That's part of what it's cataloging. So I think if we talk about healing, as an integrative process where we are constantly learning, where we're treating our body like a barometer and saying like, okay, this barometer is giving me lots of messages all the time about situations I'm in, about people I'm in relationship with, all sorts of things. If I can tune into that barometer and listen to and learn how to interpret that data, I'm going to be more comfortable in the world and in myself. I'm going to feel more at home in my body, and my body is going to feel more at home in the world. And I think, number one, that's absolutely possible. And two, that is very, I don't want to say healed, like there's an arrival point.
Right.
But I think when you get to that point, then a lot of healing work has been done.
Yeah. I know for me, because I had 3 people in my life that were abusing me. So it was my mother, my father, and my brother. And my father, we were really close, but it was just, he abandoned me. He didn't protect me. And with my mother, it was verbal and physical abuse. And then with my brother, it was verbal, physical, and emotional. What I have found is, especially with my brother, I have forgiven him, and I have worked through, I feel I've really worked through a lot of that. A lot of the abuse itself, because when I think of him now, and we don't have a relationship, and that's my choice, because he's still abusive. But I can think of him and I don't have pain. I don't have hate. I absolutely wish him the best. I just choose not to have him in my life because he's still abusive. But I really believe that you can get to a point like that where it doesn't have that every day, every moment effect on you. And that you do get to a point where I feel I'm at now, where I'm now becoming more aware of my triggers, which then helps me to manage them better, which empowers me and builds my confidence. Right.
Yep. 1,000%, 1,000%. And that's, I think, like, I'm so sorry for your experience. That's awful. And I think to get to the point where you can even think about talking about it is a huge amount of work. That takes a huge leap. And then being able to unpack it and help other people with it. And have these complicated relationships where you're like, I forgive you. And also you don't have space in my life. Like, right. That's an incredible amount of work. And what you've done is a testament to the kind of adaptation that is possible. Yes. It's really hard. It takes a lot of work, tons of work, but it is possible. And I think that's such an important message, because when people are in the thick of it, it doesn't feel possible. You feel out of control. Your symptoms are out of control. It feels like it's never going to get any better. And we have more of a say over how we feel than we think.
Yeah, that was really empowering for me when I started to learn how I could manage all this, that it didn't just come upon me and I was just a victim to this circumstance at the moment and feeling out of control. Cause it is amazing. I mean, I look back on it and it was tough. And I was really quiet about my childhood abuse. People knew about it, but I didn't talk about it. And honestly, I don't know why. There was never a time where somebody said, don't talk about it. I just didn't, and so to get to this place. And then I also had a very strong belief that I needed to just be under the radar and not talk about stuff and just, don't draw any attention. And I finally got to a point where I have done so much healing. And the number one reason why I created this podcast is so if I can get something out there like this kind of information that is going to shorten someone's pain, they're suffering, great. Because I had a lot of years of it, because there wasn't this kind of information out there. There wasn't the help that there is now. Yeah. And, I really love seeing people healed, whether I'm involved or not. It's just one of my favorite things ever. And people don't need to suffer, because there is a lot of help and there's a lot of information out there now.
Yes. And I think the more that we get that out, so there's two things that are going on there. Number one, you're getting that message out, which is helping other people, which is amazing. And two, that's part of the work of integration for you.
Yes.
Because I think we don't have a say over the things that happen to us, especially in the developmental years. And so we end up in these situations where we really, truly are a victim of our circumstances. Mm-hmm. But then we do have a say over what meaning we make out of what happened to us, and to be able to move forward in a way that helps even one other person.
Correct.
Is miraculous.
It is amazing. And I did a workshop. It was called a childhood abuse healing workshop. And I co-facilitated for 8 years. Mm-hmm. And it is the most amazing thing to see these women come in. And they were, for some of them, we kept the group small and it was intimate. And some of them came in so scared. And some of them I thought for sure was going to bolt out the door. But these women were so brave. And in the 8 years that we did it and the hundreds of women that we helped, we literally only had one run. It was amazing. Yeah. But it is, and it's so cool to see them, that first night, they're afraid. There's just a lot going on. And then by the last night, they're best friends, they're supporting each other, and it goes on. And it's just amazing. So there is healing. There's definitely measures of healing, I believe, for sure.
And I'm so glad you brought up the idea of group work like that and workshops like that, because I think written into the definition of trauma that I use, unbearable emotion that lacks a relational home, is the roadmap for healing, which is to find a relational home.
Yes.
Because trauma tricks us into thinking that we're isolated, that we have to suffer alone, that no one's going to understand, that no one has lived through something like we've lived through. And when we can get in a room with people, virtually or in person, honestly, who know what we've been through, who can relate to those core emotions, that is how we begin that work of putting those things away and integrating those memories to stop feeling those symptoms day to day.
Yeah. I mean, what we did the very first night was really powerful, because what we did on the first night is we would have every lady share just one story, and it's just a quick story, whatever story comes up first. And it is amazing when they're telling these stories. And as they're telling the stories, you can hear the lies that are coming out that they believe about themselves. But what we saw were so many magical things that night. We saw a connection, right? Because all of a sudden, somebody who's never shared her story is hearing someone share and having the same feelings, emotions, thoughts. So all of a sudden you aren't isolated, because there's something, I don't believe there's anything good in shame. Shame absolutely shuts you down, shuts your voice down, makes you alone. And we would see just the connection. And that is when their healing would begin. And even that first night, because like I said, they'd walk in the door, some of them were very scared, but by the end of that first night, they were already a little lighter. And they were starting to connect, and they were, right away the first night. So there's something about being isolated and then being in a group, for sure.
Yeah. And I also think we don't know. I think sometimes we make too complicated healing work when we are surrounded by people who are dealing with trauma, or if someone in our life is triggered and we're like, oh gosh, there's trauma there, I don't know what to do with it. You have to go talk to a therapist. And the truth is, of course, there is a time and a space for therapy, but I think we all need to get better at, number one, recognizing when we're already providing relational homes, because we all do this for each other all the time. And two, being more proactive about providing a relational home, because the more we do that, the less suffering that we will experience as a collective.
Agreed. Wow. This is really interesting. And it was funny because when I read your article, I was like, oh my gosh, she just walked me through my trigger a few months ago.
Oh, good.
All the, and it was like, everything I was doing right. And I didn't even know it.
Yeah. Which is another miraculous thing when you can see that the roadmap and see what, okay, here's the ideal. Oh, wait, I just did the ideal. Yeah. It felt terrible. but I've actually come a really long way in my own understanding. That's pretty amazing, because you're right. You said a minute ago that shame is terrible. It is no doubt the biggest barrier to healing. It's not actually the trauma, it's the shame about it.
It is. Yeah. The shame is absolutely crippling. And why do you think we feel that? Like, it makes no sense, right? I was abused. There's nothing I ever did that created any kind of trauma to happen to me. And yet I carry shame. Why do we do that? What is that about shame?
I think, I've thought about this a lot. It's a great question. I don't think we have a solid answer. I have a guess, which is that I think shame served an evolutionary purpose. In early society, if we did something that was terrible in some way, shame would serve to help us understand that if we continued that behavior, we were going to be out on our own, and that would be dangerous.
Right. That makes sense. Makes sense. Right.
And so I think when we experience something traumatic, especially in a culture that is trauma phobic, like doesn't want to talk about trauma, doesn't think it's real, isolates trauma victims, which we have. We're not living in that moment right now, but most of the time that we've been talking about trauma, that's how we've been treating people. I think that the shame tries to keep the trauma over here so we can integrate into society as if it doesn't exist.
That totally makes sense. I could totally see that. It is an odd kind of way to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
So we kind of focus on the shame and not the trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. And the shame keeps the trauma really tidy and really back here in this back closet, because I have to be out here in the world, and I want to make sure that I'm okay out here in the world and that people accept me and I belong and all that stuff. But if I bring my trauma in, then that might not happen, especially if we live in a trauma-phobic moment or culture. And so I'm going to just keep this over here.
Right.
And if you think about, like, there's so many examples of, we weren't talking about abuse in households in the United States until like the early 1990s.
I agree. No, so children
like,
there weren't even laws to protect children until like the 80s, right?
Yep.
Late 80s.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And there wasn't really a reckoning that like domestic violence was a real thing until the 90s.
Yeah.
And that's wild, because
that's not that long ago, really.
No,
I mean, my son was born in 1990, it's just
right. Not that long ago. And so I think we're talking about trauma a lot more now, which is amazing and wonderful. But if you look back quickly into the history of the study of trauma, it is full of these moments where we turn away and we say, trauma is not real. We don't need to talk about that,
Right. And frankly, that's what happened in my house.
Yeah.
It happened, and we'll just pretend like it's not really happening. And I think that was and again, there wasn't the help. I mean, okay, I was being hit by my brother, and if my mom or my father didn't like it, what are they going to do?
Right.
They couldn't call the police. I mean, they could call the police, but what are the police going to do? There were no laws in place.
Social services.
Yeah, there wasn't anything in place, and there wasn't the counseling and the coaching, and that we have now. Which it is wonderful that we have this now, and getting the word out, and we are going to shorten or people's pain and suffering so that they can live that full life, because it does happen. You can live a full life, and
absolutely.
Like the shame. I used to be cloaked in shame. I literally, everything I did, everything I thought, I carried shame. It was so embedded in me, and it was so crippling. And it's taken years, but I have been able to work through it. And you can see it still tries to resurrect itself.
Yeah.
And I didn't even really recognize it until you said it.
But it's like, it's sneaky. Shame is really sneaky. It's like pops up here and you don't see it coming. And then it's in this narrative, but it's cloaked in such a way that it doesn't feel like it's there. It's
right. And so I'm glad you said something about it, because I didn't even realize that when I said that. And it's like, and as soon as you said it, I'm like, yeah, why would I carry shame for that? Right. The only thing I can think of is because I think, well, it just seems so weird that I walk into a garage and I have, right. But I could, it could be anything.
Right.
So,
totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when you stop feeling ashamed, you can look at it and be like, okay, well, hold on, let's look at this with curiosity. Why do I feel that fear? And you have the story already. I feel that fear because my brain thinks if I walk into this garage that there are going to be tools flying and they could hit me in the head, and that would be a bad thing. So we want to avoid that. Right.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's there for a reason.
It is. And we should celebrate that, because that is, again, there's a very strong adaptive will to survive inherent in that response that we We should celebrate, not shame. And I say that knowing that it often creates distress. So I don't want to minimize that, because that distress is real. I know it. I have felt it. I have gone to battle with it. But I think when we recognize that it comes from an adaptive place, that changes the whole tenor of it.
You know, and you said something a minute ago that's really critical that somebody said to me one time, and it's really been a game changer. And that is changing judgment for curiosity. And you were saying, be curious, because it's real easy. Because I also recognize the voices in my head that were really hard on me.
Yep.
Right.
Right.
And some of them were my abusers and saying stuff to me. And so I am learning that rather than, and of course, because of my background, I tend to be very judgmental, just automatically, you know, and so I've really had to work on that and changing, you know, the judgment on myself or even others to curiosity is really healthy. And that is part of the healing process.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. It's expansive too, because when you do that, then you have all these questions that pop up, right? Instead of shaming yourself, you're like, oh wait, hold on. Why do I feel this way? Oh,
right.
I tell this story in the book in Unbroken where I couldn't eat spaghetti sauce for like 5 years. And I had no idea why. I would like crave it. I would go and make it. And then the smell of it would make me nauseated and I couldn't eat it. And
oh, no.
Never had food poisoning from it. Could not figure it out. And then one day, like an absolute lightning strike, I realized that spaghetti was the last thing my father ate before he went into the hospital and died. And so in some deep recess of my brain, in this file cabinet, in the unconscious, or however you want to label it, there is this message that spaghetti sauce is dangerous.
Yes.
Which is totally irrational and not true.
Right.
But it didn't matter. My body then is having this response because it thinks I'm about to ingest poison. And so it's like, no, don't do that. What's the quickest way we can avoid you doing this? Nausea.
Yes.
That would come up. And I was like, oh my God, I had no idea that I even remembered that.
And if you would have been hard on yourself or judged that, this thing could have gone in a whole different direction. But instead you were like, wait a minute. Right. Give me what's going on here. And then you were able to process it.
Right. And then there was like a little fragment of my dad, just to give you a story really quickly, was totally healthy, went into the hospital and within 10 days was dead, total. And he was 62, very young, vibrant. It was a crazy situation.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you. It was tough. And there's all these fragments in those overwhelming experiences that don't get put away, that your brain doesn't know what to do with. And that's a good example of one that feels totally random. And it was, of course, I hope this goes without saying, but I'll say it, not related to why he died. Right.
Sure. Yeah.
But in my brain was just gathering data and experience over the course of those 10 days and filing it away as quickly as possible because it knew something bad was happening. Yeah.
So it needed to
help me.
Yes. Right.
And so when I open with curiosity and I look at that, I'm like, oh, wow, that's number one, that's fascinating. Number two, good job, brain. You went the wrong direction, but I see what you were doing, you know?
Right. I appreciate it, but.
Right. And then three, like, oh, there's a little story there. There's a piece of this experience that I hadn't reckoned with, which is this like uncanny fact of, you know, that someone can be sitting at the dinner table 1 minute and critically ill the next.
Right.
And that there was some core fragment there that I needed to sit with and say like, okay, what do you have for me? You know?
Right.
Before I could do this integration work.
Right. Wow. And so now you can eat spaghetti sauce.
Yeah, it's no problem. Yep.
Once you figured it out, right?
Yep. Once I figured it out.
Right. Oh, interesting.
But it took like 5 years to even connect the dot, you know?
Right.
And then to be like, okay, what else needs to be worked on here? What does this mean? You know, all this stuff.
And I think that I know what's helped me when I'm trying to kind of figure this stuff out is one, talking it out in a safe space, but also journaling, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And just ask yourself a question. Just ask why can I make spaghetti sauce, but when I try to eat it makes me sick? Why?
Yep. Yeah, totally.
And and the best thing I have found to do is to just write whatever's in your brain. Don't try to think about it.
Oh my gosh.
Just start writing.
Yep. I teach book clubs and classes. And one of my favorite tools is to do a writing prompt that way, where it's like, okay, we're going to set a timer. I'm going to give you a prompt and you're going to write for 4 minutes and you are not going to stop. You're not going to edit yourself. You are just going to hear these words and then see what comes out. because it is wild.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that comes out and the patterns that you recognize if you do that regularly.
Yes.
And so you could sit down and just put at the top of the page, what's here?
What's going on?
Right.
What's happening?
Right.
Yeah. I did that. I actually did an interesting one when I was, one of the times when I was doing some soul searching, and this is going to sound funny, but I went to my parents where they're buried. Mm-hmm. And it was part of me working, like recognizing that the abuse was there, because I had recognized my brother a long time ago, but I hadn't recognized my parents, and I was starting to recognize it. Of course, it was hard to recognize that, right, and realize that. And so it was crazy. I went to their gravesite, and I don't do that. I'm not a gravesite visitor, but I felt I needed to go and sit there, and I wrote them a letter.
Oh, wow.
It was insane. It was like 10 pages. I still have it.
Oh, wow.
And I lost my mom when I was 16. She died of cancer when I was 16. So there was a lot I had to say to her, but there was a lot of realization as I was kind of going through writing this letter. And it all of a sudden, it wasn't so much about me as it became me understanding my parents a little more. Like one of the things that came out was losing my mom at 16. It was hard on me, right?
Of course.
But I never even thought about my dad. He became a single father, a widower, or widow, whichever one is right. And had to deal with a lot.
Right.
And so it really kind of opened my eyes and gave me a lot of empathy for him and understanding, because there were things that he said and did that were not okay after she died at all. But it gave me a better understanding, as an adult, and understanding what he went through. I was, of course, focused on what I was going through, and didn't have it in me to look around and see what others were going through at the time.
Right.
But it's interesting.
And it's so amazing that that your own narrative is what enabled you to see that. So sitting down and putting pen to paper is how that all got opened up. It's all in here.
It is. You just have to bring it out.
Exactly.
And for some, it's writing. For me, it's writing. Sometimes I'm talking, and this sounds crazy, but I'll talk to myself.
Totally. Yep.
I'll
who pretends that they don't is like, I don't believe that you can exist as a human being and not talk to yourself.
I have conversations with myself,
totally.
And it does help, because there's something, like you said, like you were saying, and you put science to it, of putting words out there and what it does.
Yeah. It literally brings it to the light, and then sort of like incorporates parts of your brain that might not be connected. So it's healing in a neurobiological way, and then it's healing in a kind of a more into your psyche,
This is so amazing, because you're confirming a lot of things that I've implemented in my life, and I didn't even know. And it's not like I went on the internet and found it. It's just, it came to me like, well, that makes sense. Let me try that. And then I find, science that backs it up, and it's like, oh, it's wonderful, because it did work. It does work for me.
Yeah,
definitely.
Totally. A great example of that was, I think, this, like that kind of accidental adaptation that we have when we don't even know why we're doing something, but we end up doing something that's healing, and then it works, was the beginning of the pandemic, when lockdown first started and everyone picked up a hobby.
Yes.
Think about like what our hobbies were. We were baking, we were doing puzzles, we were doing, Wordle and games like that. People were learning languages on different apps and things like that. And all of those activities require a tremendous amount of energy from your prefrontal cortex, from your rational brain. So what we were all doing collectively, without even realizing it, is regulating our brain chemistry and blood flow. Because when you're doing a task like that, you are manually pushing blood flow and electrical activity into the part of your brain that is the opposite of the fear part.
Which takes away, right?
Yep.
Restricts.
Yep.
Interesting.
I know. So it's like we do these things and then we don't notice them, which is another reason why we have to put the shame down, because I think when we shame ourselves, we are so much less likely to notice the stuff that we're doing well. We just pathologize everything and shame everything instead of being like, hold on, like that's actually a beautiful adaptation. That's genius.
Yeah. It's amazing how our bodies automatically can adapt to stuff and adjust. It's amazing. But I mean, that happens to me a lot, where I figure something out and then I find out later that, that's the right thing to do. Right. And it's, what a relief.
I know.
I knew it was working, but I don't know why it was working.
Didn't know what exactly. And then you have more data on yourself,
right.
Based on what works and in what situations and how, and then,
I mean, and that's one of the blessings for me too, in doing this podcast. And it was the same thing with the workshop. Not only did those women work through their healing, but I always before would start, something would bubble up that I had to start working on. And so I would go through a measure of healing, and doing this podcast, besides meeting amazing people, I'm learning so much. I am learning so much about trauma and, some of the healing techniques out there. The other day I interviewed, she's a doctor who she's an infertility specialist, and she helps couples who have gone through trauma and have infertility.
Yeah.
She's helped hundreds, if not thousands of couples overcome infertility just by simply having their trauma healed.
Yep. Which is again, like that's another place where when we don't talk about trauma as a society, we miss a lot of really important things, because what's at the heart of trauma is the stress response system.
Right.
And the stress response system is the thing that regulates hormones in your body.
And all the chemistry, right?
And all the chemistry. And so if your stress response system is overactive or underactive, there are going to be real biological symptoms and disease and issues that come along with that go unhealed unless you heal the root situation. So I love to hear that.
Yeah. This has been amazing. This has been great. Thank you so much.
I went by so fast.
I know it has. I know it's almost been an hour. It's crazy.
Oh my goodness.
But thank you so much for coming on and sharing. And I'd love to have you back as a guest, because this is fascinating, and we could talk about something else within trauma, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I would love to.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So tell people too, if they want to get a hold of you, how they would do that.
Yes. Okay. So the book that I just published is called Unbroken. The Trauma Response is Never Wrong. You can find that anywhere you get books, Amazon, indie booksellers, anywhere. And you can find me on TikTok and Instagram at the same handle, which is mc.phd. And then my website is just alchemycoaching.life.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. And
thank you.
We'll be tapping into this again, because it's fascinating. And I love that you're giving us the science behind the action.
Right.
Basically.
Yes.
And how that works.
It helps ground it, I think. Yeah.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.